myself. I'm Devin Metz. I'm a local tournament angler here in Indiana, from Beech Grove, Indiana originally. Pretty much fish the Crossroads walleye circuit, as well as the Indiana walleye circuit. Crossroads kind of travels a little bit more. The Indiana walleye group is kind of more central Indiana based. So just by show of hands, I mean, how many people in here would consider themselves, avid walleye fishermen or that fish for walleye, throughout the year? So, okay. So we have some people. I know I see some familiar faces as well. So we're going to talk about mostly kind of the central Indiana walleye lakes. Kind of some tactics on what we do on those lakes to catch fish, and then as much interaction as you guys want to give, any questions, maybe comments on your successes. That's going to help this be better. I don't need questions from you, no. So other affiliations. So we also are all members of the Walleye Federation that fish the Crossroads Walleye Group. The Walleye Federation's a national deal, and when we fish that tournament, the idea is to finish high enough to make the national team championship. So this year, our national team championship is going to let us travel up to Green Bay. Go ahead and start by just talking about some of the lakes here in central Indiana. Brookville Lake, Prairie Creek that's up in Muncie, Summit Lake, it's over by Newcastle. Those are probably your big three here in the central area. Eagle Creek has a pretty good population of walleye as well. It doesn't probably get hit as much because they have the 9-9 rule. So if you don't have a 9-9 on your boat, you can't really take your boat out that way. Brookville is probably going to be our most popular lake for numbers. It has some really good size. That lake is about 5,200 acres. One of the bigger reservoirs here in the state. So also Lake Monroe, that's a 10,000 acre reservoir we've got. I'm sure most people have heard or have been to Lake Monroe, but the walleye population there seemed to have been hurt over the last 10 years by fishing pressure, as well as just the lack of stocking fingerling fish. A lot of the fish that get stocked in there are going to be fries, so that's a really challenging lake. Prairie Creek is going to be a much smaller lake. That's going to be around 1,200 acres, but there are a good number of fish there. So when you go out that way, it is definitely one of the easier lakes to target walleye on. And then Summit Lake is also going to be kind of a smaller lake, 2,600 acres. So a lot of the tactics that we use on these lakes are not necessarily what you see on TV all the time. You see a lot of guys that just talk about fishing rocks with walleye, maybe some flats and stuff like that. It's pretty interesting on Brookville. We do troll some, but we spend a lot of our time jigging, and a lot of that is really similar to crappie fishing. We're using actually 16th ounce, 8th ounce jigs, tipped with a half a night crawler, and you basically drag these across the flats. That's going to start sometime towards the end of April, and pretty much through July you can expect for a majority of folks to be fishing in that manner. So something as simple as just a 16th ounce crappie jig. On this one here, I've got, it's a Slow Pro spinning jig. It's got a little propeller to put off some vibration. If you guys are out there in the show, you will see Slow Pro out there. He makes a really good product. a bunch of different colors and some different sizes, but 16th to 8th ounce jigs. I try and go as small as I can, but I still want to make sure I'm able to keep contact with the bottom.
What pound test is it?
I like to use 6 pound test when I'm doing this. I know some other guys prefer to go 8 pound, but for me, I think 6 pound test is probably the best. You get the feel, and most of the walleye you're going to catch in Indiana are not going to break you off on 6 pound test. So that's a great question. So a little bit about the equipment that we use for that. This here is just going to be a 6.6 medium action rod. This is a St. Croix. Any medium action rod with a faster tip, that would be what I would look for when wanting to get set up with this. As far as your reel, you want to probably go with like a 2000 series reel. Most of the lakes you're going to be fishing anywhere from between 6 and 12 to 15 foot of water. A lot of people always say walleye are going to be in deeper water. In Indiana, it doesn't really seem to be that way. A lot of times those fish are in 6 foot or shallower. And it also kind of depends on the clarity of the lakes and whatnot with that. So, Brookville tends to be a little bit dirtier, especially in the spring. We're getting that runoff from the river. So with that, a lot of those fish tend to want, a brighter colored jig, something that's going to show up through the mud. Also, those fish seem to go shallow, especially early in that springtime. So, any questions so far?
Are you using a twister tail on that jig, or what do you?
I do at times. Early this time of year, mostly I would say pre-spawn. I'm using a twister tail or a paddle tail. A lot of the paddle tails seem to let off a little bit more vibration, and that seems to work on those. That's more of a casting technique. I won't drag those behind. Most of the time in Brookville, I'll go with live bait and go with the half a night crawler. But yeah, when I'm talking about getting some of that runoff, something bright like this orange and chartreuse spinner tail, that's going to be something I look at on our clear lakes. I'm kind of looking at our purples. Chartreuse is always a good color, no matter what the clarity is. But yeah, that's actually a really good casting presentation. Like I said, early in the spring, a lot of those fish are either up in the rivers or really close to the rivers that go into these reservoirs. Twister tail and a jig is going to be probably the easiest way to go target those fish. I live a little bit further north than Indy now, and I know a lot of the lakes up there. Pretty much from March on, that's a great way to go at them, is with that twister tail. These here are ones that I use. They are by a company called Bow Hunter Baits. They're also here as well. This time of year, a lot of these fish will go. Has anybody in here heard of what they call silver buddies, or just a blade bait? I'm sure. So this is going to be a blade bait. This is a 1-inch blade bait here. And pretty much what you do, you tie directly to your line. It's got a couple places that you can change the settings to where you get more vibration or less vibration, depending on where you put that clip. What you can do with those, you can fish them a couple different ways. Pretty much you can go just straight up and down vertical. You can also cast them with a slow retrieve, or actually hop them back and forth. That's a really good way to target walleyes throughout, really throughout the entire year. There's a way to fish those. When we're fishing deeper water, I like to fish those off the bottom. A lot of those fish are going to be in the deeper water right now. They'll probably be moving up, into the spawning grounds and stuff like that towards the first part of April. Once that water starts to get into the 40s, they start getting ready to move up there and get ready to spawn. The bigger females are going to move up, and you know, when they do that, those fish are going to move up shallow, up next to rocks or hard bottom. They want something hard that they can spawn on. So another way that we like to target walleye, and here locally, I usually will start trolling generally in the spring, first part of April. I like to cast before that. And what we'll do is we actually, we'll troll crankbaits and basically try and target those fish that are over the basins, the larger basins. When they move up on the flats post-spawn, this is a really good way to do that as well. When you're doing this, you want to look at a couple of different things. Number one, you want to try and match the bait that these fish are chasing. Most of the time, I'm looking at the profile of the fish itself. So if they're, you know, chasing, you know, perch, I'm maybe going with a longer profile bait. If they're chasing like, you know, baby bluegill or smaller panfish, I'll go with a shorter, kind of fatter style bait. So, you know, this is a size 9 flicker minnow. And this is going to be something you can use on any lake across central Indiana. Again, you kind of want to look at your color choices based on water clarity. When that water is muddy or murked up, you want to go with something brighter. If you're fishing a really clear lake, like, you know, let's say you're at Summit Lake, very clear, you're going to go with more of a natural presentation, or a darker color bait. Speed is a big thing as well. So early on in the year when that water is colder, you know, your presentation is going to be cold. We fish a lot up on Lake Erie as well throughout the year. I was out there about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and you know, our speed was anywhere from 0.8 miles an hour all the way to 1.2, which is very slow when you're talking about trolling. In the springtime, once that water gets up, you can troll much faster, even, you know, 2.5, sometimes even up to 3 miles an hour I'll go. But when those fish move onto the shallower flats, I like to change over to kind of a small, it's almost like a panfish style crankbait. And those will have a much tighter action. You can run them at a slower speed, and you can cover water more when you're trolling like that. So this one here is actually, this is a rattling wasp. This is made by COOT'S lures. It works well at fast speeds, works well at slow speeds. The action of this is going to give you a much tighter wobble through the water. And it seems to be when the water temp heats up, those really fish well. So another bait that we use for trolling is going to be the actual flicker shad. I personally like to fish the size 7s. The size 5s work well if the bait fish are really small, but this is a size 7, and we pull those behind planer boards as well. We have a couple different planer board setups, and I'm not sure if anybody really knows kind of what all planer boards do, but this is a church planer board. This is a TX22. So when we're trolling, a lot of these lakes, the walleye are really spooky. So if you're going through, the actual boat can scare these fish or spook these fish off to the side. So the trolling, when we're pulling the planer board, we're trying to get that bait away from the boat so that those fish don't see us coming, basically. So we'll run, generally speaking, we'll run 3 rods out each side. These will get that bait away from the boat. On here we have this light. This is for night trolling. Walleye do feed at night. Actually probably better than they feed during the day. But this light here, it's another product made by COOT'S lures. And what that does, it just allows you to see your boards at night. When that goes towards the inside, you know you've got a fish on there. The other thing too that I would say, so we've got two different sizes. This is a size 12, this is a size 22. So in the bigger size, I'm pulling this on bigger water, especially when it gets rougher, because you want to be able to see, you want to be able to make sure the waves are not pulling the board to the inside. This has got a little bit more body to it. On our inland lakes here in Indiana, I'm pulling these smaller ones, the TX12, more so than I am pulling the 22s. And there's a couple reasons. One of the big reasons is here in Indiana, we have a ton of panfish, a ton of trash fish. And when I say trash fish, I'm talking about like yellow bass or really small bluegills, things like that. These boards detect the bite a lot better than the TX22s. They're just a lot more sensitive. The other nice thing is that if you're pulling through weeds, this smaller board will actually be out of line when you're pulling that. So if you get weeds on your bait, you're able to detect that a lot better. That way you're actually keeping your bait in the strike zone a little bit longer. Let's see. So the other thing we wanted to talk about is going to be your jig and live bait preference. So I know you brought up the twister tails earlier, but your jig and live bait, generally before that water hits, you know, in the 50s, I'm going to be tipping any type of jig that I'm using with a minnow or a bait fish. The reason why is because basically night crawlers are not going to be out when that air temperature is in the 40s. You don't see a whole lot of night crawlers. When it gets into the 50s and 60s, that's more of a natural bait, and we seem to do better on night crawlers later on in the season. So I try and do the same thing in the fall. When the fall is switching over into that early winter time, we're going to switch over to more of a bait fish instead of the night crawlers. And then the other thing too is, so these plastics, there's a bunch of different kinds of twister tails as well as these paddle tails. Like I mentioned before, it seems like this paddle tail gives off more vibration, but the twister tail definitely will do that. So does anybody have any questions as far as central Indiana lakes at all?
What about Mississinawa?
Mississinawa, that's a great question. I personally don't fish Mississinawa very often. I fish it for crappie quite a bit, but I have not really targeted walleye on that lake. So just knowing where it's at, and you know, the clarity, I would say, you know, if you're trying to target fish in that area, you're going to want to probably go with some brighter colors. The water is stained up there a good part of the year, and that's probably what I would do. I would go with something that's going to be probably more vibration and brighter colors, especially early in the year, just because of the current and whatnot.
So positioning your boat do you always troll, or are you able to position your boat and cast?
So that's a great question. So the question was, do we position our boat so that we can cast, or do we always troll? So yes, we absolutely position our boat. Boat control is going to be huge. So I use a Minn Kota trolling motor that has a spot lock feature on that. And generally speaking, what I'll do is, you know, I'll hit that spot lock to where we're off of structure. Maybe we don't sit on top of it, and we can cast to that structure. A good example with that would have been, we had our championship this past October. We were up on Crooked Lake, and basically where those fish were located were right on the edge of the weeds in about 10 to 12 foot of water. We had positioned our boat in about 18 feet of water, and we're able to cast back there and to watch those fish. You know, that's a great question with that. Sometimes that's actually better than trolling, because if those fish are consolidated, you can really work on that group of fish and kind of, you know, target one fish at a time.
I mean, I just always wondered, you know, you can't get close enough trolling to the edge without hitting your motor on rocks or anything else.
Very correct.
So at that point, is it easier to cast into them and try to work?
It kind of depends on what you have underneath the water. So if there's not a lot of snags and it's just shallow water, that's where these planer boards are great, because as you're trolling parallel to that, you can get that bait out towards that shallow water. If there's a lot of snags in that, you're going to want to make sure, I would actually anchor or spot lock in the deeper water and cast to that shallow stuff.
Yeah.
So as far as, and that kind of brings this up as well. Electronics, when you're walleye fishing, is absolutely key. So you want to make sure that you have a good graph that has side imaging. Side imaging is really big for me. Some guys I know will tell you that they don't use it very often, but it's a game changer once you begin to learn that. Like I said, when we're fishing shallow water, like a lot of these fish are going to spook off to the sides, and if you're able to see them, you know, 50 to 75 feet out to the side of your boat, it gives you a total advantage as far as the angler. And, you know, if you're able to, you know, put your planer boards out there and get on top of those fish, or if you're able to anchor and cast out, that's going to be a complete advantage to the angler in the boat if you're able to see those fish further out. Another thing is live scope. Live scope has kind of changed the whole fishing world here in the last couple years. And so last year was my first year really using live scope in the boat, but you know, this allows you to look around your boat in 360 degrees. You can actually target individual fish, because not every fish you see on the graph is going to be active. And that's important to make sure that you're finding those active fish. When we're actually going out and trying to graph different areas, we may be looking at our graph and we see tons of fish that are in that bottom, you know, 5 to 7 feet, and you're looking at those fish and you wonder why they won't bite. And then you're trolling through there and you may see some fish elevated, you know, maybe 5 to 10 feet off the bottom. Those fish tend to feed more. So when I'm out graphing and looking for fish on my sonar, you know, I'm looking for those fish that are elevated off the bottom. That's going to be one of the biggest things that I look for, because those fish are up there to do one thing, and that's eat. I would say that, you know, with the live scope itself, not everybody has that advantage. They're expensive, and honestly, I mean, it's kind of a crapshoot if you don't use it. So it's like, I would recommend that whatever graph anybody has on their boat, I would tell them to make sure they understand all the functions of that graph first. So if it has side imaging, if it has down imaging, making sure that it's tuned, and then also making sure that you know, you've got all your settings right, and that you know how to use those functions of the graph before you start trying to learn stuff that's new. So, any other questions? Hey, I'm still the same way. I'm still learning stuff on mine.
So, say you're going out on Monroe, like in Pine Grove, on a kayak with 2D sonar.
Yeah.
Are you going to visually look for something to?
So what I would
to
look
go
for,
and then use your graph.
so you're looking for, so if you're using 2D sonar, basically what you're getting is that's shooting a signal down from your transducer, and it's getting the reflection of what's off the bottom. So everything you see on a sonar is not going to be fish. When that shoots that signal down and comes back, if you're seeing like a solid on the bottom, obviously you're looking for structure. In Pine Grove, I would definitely look for structure, look for, you know, any wood, rocks. Is yours color?
Yeah.
Okay, so on that, you also.
It's a striker for it.
Okay,
Devin.
so what I would do is I would look for the change in the color on the bottom, because you're
Okay.
going to be able to tell the difference between a soft and hard bottom. However, you have the palette set up
Okay.
with that graph. So I seen you had your hand up.
Whenever you're using your live scope, are you mainly using forward facing or are you using like perspective?
Okay, so I use both. Generally speaking, like I've used the perspective more in an ice fishing situation, or when I'm fishing like really deep water, I like the perspective mode a little bit better. The forward facing, I like to look, especially when we're searching. Once we find fish, that perspective mode actually can show you a little bit more detail, depending on how your graph's set up. But yeah, I would say forward facing probably 90% of the time. Any other questions on that?
So you was talking about them line counters.
Yep.
How do you know how much line to let out?
That's a good question. So what he's talking about here, he'd ask about the line counters. This reel on here, it'll actually, so when you're letting out your lure, it'll tell you exactly how many feet you have out. Reason why that's important, obviously, you want to know where your lures are running. I use the Precision Trolling app on my phone, and basically you can go in there. You can enter just about any lure out there on the market, and it will tell you what the dive curve is on that. It will tell you exactly how deep those crankbaits are going to go, at how many feet you let out of line. And so, you know, if you put in let's say a bandit, deep diving bandit crankbait, which is what most people use on Lake Erie, you can let out 100 feet of line. Look at that app and it will tell you that lure is at 14 feet or 15 feet or whatever it is. You can correspond that information to what you're seeing on your graph, and that's actually probably one of the biggest tools that we use out there. Thanks for bringing that up. That's a good point.
What's the app again?
It is called Precision Trolling.
Does that have to do with the speed you're trolling also? You have to have that entered in?
So what they will actually do on that, it's based on, let's see, pull it up real quick. So that is based on 10-pound test, monofilament line. Trilene is what they tested that on. And most of the time, you don't really need anything more than that when you're out there trolling those fish. So when I pull up like a 300 series bandit, and I know the ones in the back probably can't see this very well, but I can go in there and it says feet down, feet back, and then miles per hour. And so when you go down, you say you want to run 10 feet down, well, that means that I have to let out 38 feet of line. And that's what's so important about these line counters. That tells you exactly what it is. You do have to calibrate those. We do that at least once a year or whenever we re-spool, because you want to make sure that when you pull off 10 feet of line, you're actually showing 10 foot of line on your counter. That can get off by a foot or two. And then when you're talking about letting out, 80 to 100 feet of line, that number can actually be off quite a bit. So great question on that. Thank you. Anybody else have any questions on any of that?
What are them little flags for?
That's a good question. So these flags are actually just to basically shows you when you have a fish on. Nice thing about church boards is they actually give you the option to rig these flags to where they're up all the time, or if you want to rig them to where they're down, and then when you get a bite, the flag pops up. And that's helpful if you have some smaller fish, or maybe a fish that just grabs onto your bait and swims with it. Not always is that board going to go to the inside when you get it on. On the other one here, just when you get a bite, that flag's going to go down, and generally the board is going to track into the inside. The reason why we rigged this one with the flag down is going to be basically, I pull these bigger boards up on the Great Lakes. A lot of times the waves are choppy, and your line actually can get caught on that. If it gets slack in your line, it can get caught on that flag. So a lot of times I just rig them down to keep from that happening.
Another good question.
So just talk a little bit about some of the other products that we use. So we have a booth here as well. It's COOT'S Lures. They make trolling rods. They make different tools to use out there on the water. Their trolling rods are something that Rusty, my partner here, and I have used here for the last 4 years. They have 7-foot medium lights, 7-foot mediums, 8-footers, and 8/6 mediums. These 7-foot medium lights have been awesome as far as on our inland lakes here. They also double for a crappie rod for me. I pull crankbaits to catch crappie on these as well. Definitely check them out. They're not going to break the bank. That's the one nice thing about them. $45 I think for the 7-footers, 55 for the 8s, and 60 for the 8/6s. 65 for the 8/6s. There you go. And then another product that they use, and this is a must in the boat. This is going to be the Magnet Go. Basically what this is just a net management system. So when you go to net that, it keeps the net out of the way. It doesn't get under if you're fishing in current. And then when you net the fish, it pops down, and that can be attached to any landing net. It's got a couple different ways you can set it up. For our inland lakes, I like to set it up to where I attach it to the D-ring that's on here. For the bigger lakes and rivers, I like to attach it to the magnet because it gives it a little bit more resistance. But again, it's just a good way to keep the net out of the way. And it's a cheap investment to have in that. The other thing, like we had talked about earlier, he also has the Firefly lights. Those are what we put on here, and they have orange and green for your port and starboard side of the boat. That also helps if you're out there at dark for people to see you. That way they don't run into your lines and all that good stuff. We also have a bunch of different crankbaits, the Rattling Wasp. And like I said, these work well for walleye. These work well for crappie. I haven't really caught any bass. I know Rusty caught a big wiper on one last year, but the nice thing about these is even when you're pulling jigs or you're moving slow, you can stick one of these out the side on a trolling rod, and it will run. The thin back end will allow this thing to actually get action where you got more than one presentation. And I think that's really, that's all the stuff I have on here to talk about. Is there any other questions, specific questions about lakes? Maybe anything you got? What do you got, Brad?
What if, using your precision trolling app and all that, you can't get your lure down as deep as what you're seeing the fish?
Awesome. I don't have any of those with me, but that's a great question. So what his question was is, there is a limit to when you put your lure on that precision trolling app. There's going to be a deep end limit. So let's say your lure will have a max dive of 20 feet and you need to get it down to 35 feet. You can actually go into this AIM trolling app, and they make these things called snap weights, and it will tell you how many feet back you need to put that snap weight to get your lure down to that specific depth. So that's a great question. Those snap weights come in generally 1 to 6 ounces. Here locally, a 1 or 2 ounce snap weight would be pretty much all you would need.
Do you use the bottom bouncer?
Absolutely. Generally, we'll use the bottom bouncers more with like harness fishing and stuff like that. Summit Lake more so than others. It's a really weedy lake, so we do like to get the bottom bouncers help us out on that lake. We pull those. Generally 1 to 2 ounces is about all you need for the lakes around here.
Do you guys tip your lures and stuff with live bait, or do you just leave it as what it is there?
So most of the time on our crankbaits, most of the time we just fish it normal. There are times when, you know, putting a half a night crawler on one will absolutely help. I've seen that work more so on the Great Lakes than here, but it would definitely work on the inland lakes as well. We do sometimes, we'll put, you know, a minnow head or something like that on our jigs, even with a plastic, just to give it scent. So, I mean, early on, that's probably more so what I would do.
Well, my uncle always used to use the erie dearies, and then after that, he used to go and use leeches.
Yep.
And I'm like,
Yeah, leeches can be a good bait. But one thing I would say about central Indiana specifically, leeches are not really natural as far as the size of leech that you would need to use for bait. So I don't use leeches a lot, especially local. If I go up into northern Indiana, like Winona Lake, Pike Lake, Bass Lake, those lakes I will use leeches. There's times where that's the only thing they'll bite. You know, and generally speaking, you know, as far as, you know, erie dearies, I don't use them. I do use casting harnesses, but generally speaking, I know they work. They caught fish for years, so I know that they would still catch fish today. Yes, sir.
When you were casting the 16th and 8th ounce jigs,
Yep.
what kind of soft plastic was it, like 3-inch or?
Yeah, so most of the time I'll go with a 3-inch. And generally if I'm casting jigs, I'm gonna go with at least an 1/8 ounce. If I can go a little bit bigger than that, I will. But yeah, generally gonna be a 3-inch, something like this. And you know, this is pretty much.
That's a bright color.
Yeah, I would use the brighter colors in a muddier water situation. But you know, I mean, as far as when you get into the clear lakes, I like to use some of their clears or whites, just to give it more of a natural presentation. Have anybody else? Yeah.
About rivers
What about rivers?
in Indiana.
So I like in rivers, a lot of times we'll cast jigs just like we're talking here. Early on, I would say that has been probably my most successful presentation. Harnesses work really well in rivers, but you want to make sure that you're fishing slow. You have to remember that current is also speed. And so when you're going against the current, whatever your boat speed is going to add to whatever the current speed is. So you do want to make sure that you're doing that. I would say harnesses are probably one of my favorite ways to go on a river, especially in the summertime. I think that's the best way.
Any particular rivers in Indiana are good for it?
St. Joe River up north is an excellent river system. There's a lot of different ways to fish it. Some of the areas on the St. Joe fish just like any lake you go to in the state. But you know, there are other areas that have a lot of higher current as well.
Hey, Devin. Planer board.
Yeah, the planer boards came into play up there this year. We were actually anchored, and you throw this planer board out to the side. We're casting jigs, but we've got 2 crankbaits out to each side of the boat, just to get the baits away and be able to cover more water. That was one of the biggest things for us. Also, I mean, if you're fishing any type of structure, down trees, or bridge pylons, anything like that, you can actually let out the line, get your baits in front of those bridge pylons.
Use those from bank also. If you're a bank fisherman, take a planer board and let the current tape pull the,
Oh.
yeah.
Yeah, they definitely
That'd
work.
be getting a kayak.
Yes.
For sure, absolutely. So we've got just a few minutes, sure.
Do you ever use any type of leader system in front of your bait to keep from biting?
We use leaders, probably more so on our trolling rods than anything. And the biggest part of that is to make sure that we keep them calibrated if it breaks. Most of the time, if your line breaks and it breaks at the leader, you don't have to re-spool your whole reel. So we do use leaders for that. If I'm casting, blade baits, I'll use braided line as far as my main line, and then I'll have a leader set up with like fluorocarbon, like 7 or 8 pound fluorocarbon is what I'll use as a leader. But that's pretty much the only times I personally use them. I know other people are, everything that they have has a leader tied on, but that's how we use them. Anything else?
Yep, we're like totally beginners, and I've never fished for
Sure.
walleye, but we've trolled at Monroe, a few points that we were given by people that, that fish walleye there.
For sure.
And I never had any luck. I mean, I caught a walleye by accident, but it was, purely accidental.
Congratulations.
Yeah. I was gonna tell you, you're not alone on that. We had a tournament out there a couple of years ago, and I don't remember how many boats we had, but I think we had 18 or 19 boats. And I think only three boats weighed in fish. The population of fish is not as good as some other lakes on Monroe. But the size of the fish in Monroe, on average, is probably one of the best in the state.
Right.
Where are you local to Central Indiana? Or?
Yeah, we live in Beach Grove.
Okay.
But I mean, there's an area like across from Four Winds out there that's flat rocky bottom.
Yep.
And 8 to 10, 12 feet, depending on what the lake level is.
Mm-hmm.
And we've, back and forth across there. We've used repellers with petroleum,
For sure.
shad, minnow. I mean, night crawler tip blade. We've tried everything, and of course, I'm not very good at it. Hey, we're just trying.
Hey, that honestly, I mean,
Everybody hates
you're
Monroe.
doing, yeah, I know that. One of the big things that we'll do at Monroe is actually, we'll pull, 1/8 ounce jigs, tipped with like half a night crawler. They do get them trolling out there, absolutely. But we'll actually, just use our trolling motor to pull the boat anywhere from like 0.7 to 1 mile an hour. Some areas over there that are, that area that you're talking about in front of Four Winds is actually, that's a good area. But also, the area, I think it's Morse Creek.
Okay.
That's another good area. And it really depends too on the water level. When the water gets up, Morse Creek seems to fish better.
Yeah.
Pine Grove
there.
is another one.
Yeah.
And when the water gets up, those areas do fish well. But that's kind of the way that we, we generally attack that way. There is quite a few snags in Morse Creek, so buy a lot of jigs because you'll lose some for sure. But have you been to Brookville?
We have.
Okay. Yeah, I like Brookville better than I do Monroe, but it's a crapshoot. What you got?
As far as the southern tier of the state, how does Patoka compare to Monroe as far as size-wise with the fish? Is similar? Is it-
Pawtucka's got some giant fish. We had a tournament out there this year that, honestly, I think it was probably the heaviest weigh-in that we've had as a club. I think the winners brought in, it was over 20 pounds for their 5-fish limit. And so, I mean, they were averaging anywhere from 4 to 5 pounds of fish. There's small ones in there too, but Pawtucka really surprised us. We hadn't really fished that lake as far as our tour goes until this year. We definitely wanted to make sure we got it back on the schedule for this year. So, yeah, I would say Pawtucka is kind of one of the hidden gems, or was a hidden gem until the last couple of years. Sure.
Yes.
Do you guys have any influence over the stocking numbers and how they're, you know, because they're stocking fry in some of these lakes, and are they getting eaten up before they start to grow, or
Good question.
what's happening?
A lot of places, yes. Monroe is one of those places. You know, and we don't have any direct influence as far as what stock where or what size fish. But generally speaking, the lakes that are getting fingerling size fish are having a higher success rate than the ones that are just getting fry. Monroe is a perfect example of that. You know, in the last 6 or 8 years, all they put in is fry.
Okay, but their lake management, are they asking the people that are actually fishing it, and does it matter to them? Because it seems like, you know, they need to be asking the fishermen, you know?
I wish they would. Yeah, no, I mean, and, you know, there are other clubs as well as, you know, I know Crossroads Walleye is trying to work this year to help with some additional stocking. But like Michiana Walleye up north, I know is really big into that. And we try and give feedback as much as we can to DNR, but, you know, as far as actually making those decisions.
Right, is it falling on a deaf ear if you guys are?
Sometimes it does. I know a couple of years ago, they did go out and do some surveys to try and figure out how much natural reproduction's out there. You know, they say it may be only like, you know, 1% natural reproduction. And the big thing with that is, you know, if we have 1 million walleye in there, 1% of 1 million walleye is still, you're going to get walleye in there. So it's, you know, I think another thing that we can look at as well is selective harvest. You know, the COVID year, these lakes got slammed. Every day, the boat ramp looked like a Saturday, and everybody, I won't say everybody, there are some people out there who do a great job at catch and release, but when you have that many more boats hitting the lakes and keeping their limits, and it definitely takes a toll. And that's totally all right to keep whatever fish we catch as long as we're legal. But I generally will release fish that are over a certain size limit. And I think that helps out. I see you had your hand up.
Yeah. It's kind of two parts. Unfortunately, I'm from behind enemy lines over there. That stayed over there for the west.
There's good fish over there too.
Well, that's what I was gonna ask. Do you fish anything over in Illinois? And
Oh.
also, do you have any power plant lakes here? So I'm 14 miles from Shelbyville.
Okay, so,
And
Good lake.
Clinton is a power plant lake.
correct.
They've got awesome walleye in both places, as does Decatur.
Yeah, so power plant lakes here, we don't really have a lot of that. There is Turtle Creek down south, but there is not a walleye population there at all. As far as, you know, going over into that area there, Shelbyville's an awesome fishery. I've heard good things about Clinton, but I've never fished it. I know some guys down by Terre Haute that really like to go over that way. So we're coming up close to 1 o'clock, or 2 o'clock. Is there any other questions? 1 or 2?
You know anything about Colombo Reservoir? There's softball in there, I don't.
They
Have
do.
been.
Catch 'em.
Numbers wise, you know, I haven't really heard a ton of success rate over there. I know guys do catch fish there. That's an area that I just moved north up to that area. So I'm hoping to get over there soon. But I have not I have not personally fished it.
What crappie group do you tournament fish with?
It was a Crappie USA, and I haven't, taken that seriously most of the time. If I see they have an event on Brookville or something like that, I may fish their group. But yeah, Crappie USA is a good group. With that, guys, I just want to say thank you for coming here, and thanks for the questions. If you guys see us out at the booth, stop by. I'll be at COOT'S Lures booth, or Bow Hunter Baits. I think those are 35 and 36. So, yeah, if you guys have any other questions or comments, stop by, and we'll be glad to talk. Thank you.